Good evening, everyone. My name is Greg Newman. I'm the Manager of Planning with the City of White Rock. And it's my pleasure to start our first City of White Rock digital public information meeting. I'm going to be the face behind the voice that you hear for the next hour and a half or so. We have two iterations of the presentation to go through and a couple breaks in between to try to respond to your questions. So I'm going to post the presentation and hopefully everyone is able to get the technology working and to follow along. So tonight's digital public information meeting relates to the proposed West Beach Business Area Commercial Residential Small Lot Zone, or it's referred to as the CR-3A zone. The purpose of the meeting tonight is to inform the public of the intent and the details of the draft CR-3A zone, to try and clarify the scope of the proposal and the zone standards, and to receive your feedback and questions. This is being provided as a live event. As I mentioned, my name is Greg Newman. I'll be going through the slides with you. The meeting is being recorded and will be posted on the city's webpage afterwards. So there's the link there in the screen to the City of White Rock webpage. Comments and questions that we received tonight will be provided eventually to council as a transcript or as a summary. You may find that some of your comments and questions that you can hopefully see in the right-hand side of your screen, they may not be published. We are going to look for questions that are perhaps not related to the application, perhaps they're not respectful in their content or are repetitive. So if we receive those, we will not publish them, which ultimately means that you won't be able to see them. But that's not to say that we aren't receiving them, and that's why we will at some point provide the full transcript to council so they know exactly what we received in full. If you do have additional questions after tonight's presentation, feel free to send them to me by email. My email address is on the screen there, and we will provide a PDF copy of this presentation on the webpage as well. So this is early stages in the project or in the rezoning application. Following the meeting, we're going to receive your feedback and start to evaluate it and look at potential changes to the draft CR-3A zone. We'll then look at preparing a draft bylaw to present to the Land Use and Planning Committee and ultimately Council for first and second reading. After that, if the bylaw receives first and second reading, there would be a public hearing. And it's at that public hearing that you would have an opportunity to speak directly to council about your interests or concerns on this application. We would then, taking that feedback from the public hearing, finalize the bylaw for third reading before council, and if it's given third reading, it would then go back to council for fourth and final reading. So the scope of the current application, so this application is specific to two properties, and I think that's important to sort of stress, because a number of the comments that we've received to date have asked, is this applicable to a number or the entirety of the West Beach area? And the answer is no. This rezoning applies specifically to the Little India restaurant site and to the Cilantro Indian Cuisine restaurant property as well. And those are sort of shown in the pictures below. Other property owners that may wish to have the CR-3A zone apply to their property if it were approved by council would need to, at a minimum, satisfy the maximum lot width requirement, which I'll go through in a moment. And they would also need to apply for a property-specific rezoning application, which would be subject to public review, like the process I've just laid out here, and ultimately council approval. So I'm just going to drive you sort of past the two properties. So the Little India restaurant there is sort of in the middle of this photo. What I wanted to point out is as you drive west along Marine Drive, you can see on the right-hand side of this image that there are some buildings that are 3 and even 4 stories further to the east. And then as you approach the core of the hub of Marine Drive here, you start to see single-story and 2-story buildings further west. So you see Little India there, and then moving closer to Little India, we have just east of the property, there is a The building that has a sort of covered parkade area with 3 stories of residential use above, and you can see Little India being one of the subject properties and the abutting 2-story building as well. This is just looking from the other direction, and again you can see in the background there that there are buildings that are 3 stories in height on top of a single-story parkade below. This is now looking at the second property that's subject to this rezoning application. So Cilantro Indian Cuisine there in the middle, next to the Boathouse restaurant. So Cilantro is currently within a 2-story building. The Boathouse restaurant, I just wanted to note that it is a 2-story building with a 3rd-story rooftop patio, so open air rooftop patio. So just looking at the property a little closer. And this is the view of the Cilantro property from behind. And I just wanted to point out, you can see the 3rd-story stairwell on top of the Boathouse restaurant. That gives you a sense of the current massing and scale of the 2 properties. So just to kind of orient you as it relates to the official community plan and the policy context that applies to these 2 properties. So the official community plan, or the OCP, currently designates the lands along Marine Drive between Oxford and State as waterfront village, where buildings up to 4 stories in height and 2.0 floor to area ratio are recognized. That's not to say that they're anticipated, but they are acknowledged within the policies of the plan. So now I'm going to use the Little India property as sort of the base to go through the CR-3A zone standards that are being proposed with this application. So the first standard relates to minimum lot width, and as I mentioned, to be eligible to even be considered for the CR-3A zone, the property would have to have frontage of less than 12.4 meters, or lot width, I should say, of less than 12.4 meters. So you can see that on the screen there, the red line represents the lot width. So again, the maximum lot width of a property within the CR-3A zone would be 12.4 meters. It's actually an error in the header there. It should say maximum lot width standard. Now, maximum building height has quite obviously been a great topic of interest, and the CR-3A zone would allow for a maximum building height of 13.7 meters, or roughly 45 feet, as measured along the midpoint of the lot line on Marine Drive. And I think it's really important to stress that, because I understand in the community there have been materials shared that perhaps suggest that the maximum height would be measured from a natural grade, which is somewhat arbitrary in that it's measured from a historic natural elevation of the property. In this case, the CR-3A zone very explicitly says that height would be measured along the midpoint of the lot line on Marine Drive. So it would not be measured from a historic natural grade partially moving up the hill. So on a sloped property, if you're measuring from natural grade, there may be a means by which someone could argue for a taller building, but in this case, that would not be applicable. The text on the other side here speaks to what the current CR-3A or CR3 zone allows for us. The current zoning of these properties allows for a maximum height of 11.3 meters, measured from the natural grade at the midpoint of the wall on the lowest side of the lot. So the south end of the wall, the midpoint measured from the natural grade of the property, or 0.5 meters above the average height of the curb on the low side of the lot, so in this case, Marine Drive. So it's a bit convoluted and a bit confusing, but it's the lower of those 2 points. And I think the other thing that's important to note on Marine Drive is the CR3 zone stipulates that the front setback must be a minimum of 1.5 meters and cannot be any greater than 2.5 meters. And why that's important is because, again, if you have a property with a more historic steep slope moving back, there may be a means in the CR3 zone to argue a riding up of that slope. But if you front onto Marine Drive, you really can't ride that slope back away from the street, because you do have to have the building face between 1.5 and 2.5 meters. Ultimately, the proposal would allow for an additional height of roughly 2.4 meters or 7.8 feet of additional building height. The building setbacks proposed within the CR-3A zone would be a front setback, a minimum front setback of 2.5 meters, and an exterior setback of 1.5 meters. And we have received comments and concerns about there not being a prescribed interior side or rear yard setback in the draft CR-3A zone. So we are certainly open with the feedback that we received tonight to looking at incorporating some of those provisions, such as, for example, bringing the 1.5 meter interior side yard and rear yard setback from the CR3 zone into this proposed CR3A zone. The proposed parking standards for the CR3A zone would be 1 space per unit for any one unit, 2 unit, or 3 unit residential use, plus 1 space for visitors within the entire building. The standard rate of parking outside of this zone is 2 spaces per 1, 2, and 3 unit residential use. So there is a reduction there proposed. The general parking standards, say for commercial uses, would apply without change. And the bylaw amendments would also introduce a potential for a cash in lieu of parking payment of, as proposed, $40,000 per space for the required commercial and visitor parking only. So there would not be an opportunity to pay cash in lieu of parking for the required residential parking spaces. As it relates to maximum density, so the proposed CR3A zone would allow for gross floor area to be 2 times the area of the property, provided an amenity contribution of $645 per square meter was provided for the floor area above 1.75. So you see on the right hand side there's an example where we take the lot area of the Little India site. It's roughly 180 square meters. 2.0 FAR, or 2 times the lot area, would allow for a total building gross floor area of 360 square meters, or roughly 3,800 square feet. To build up to 2.5 FAR, 0.25 of that total lot area would be subject to an amenity contribution of $645 per square meter. So when you do the math, it equates to about a $29,000 contribution into the Community Amenity Reserve Fund for the purposes of improvements to the Marine Drive and Waterfront Village area. So we've put together some illustrations of what the CR3A zone may look like if built out on these 2 properties. So this is the Little India site. You can see the rendering here that shows how it may be developed with a building that maxes out the height with some additional stepping back of the building to provide for some lessening impacts along the streetscape. This is an illustration of the development of the property at Cilantro. Again, you can see here it's conceptualized as a 4-story building with some stepping back from Marine Drive to again soften the impact of the building on the pedestrian realm. So with that, we're now available to receive and respond to questions and comments. I'm just looking at our live Q&A box now. And with me in the room, I should mention, I've got Carl Isaac, our Director of Planning and Development Services Department, and Athena van Hossen is also on the line. So.
And I'll field the first question that's been published in the Q&A. So on the right-hand side of your screen, actually, if you hover your cursor over the middle, you'll see a bar that has a question mark and some speech boxes. So if you click on that box, you should see the Q&A questions pop up on the right-hand side of your screen. You'll be able to provide your own questions there, as well as see what others have provided. The first one from Anonymous at 540. Why is the city increasing the building height to 5 stories when 4 stories on Marine Drive will block the beach, tree, and ocean views for many owners to the north? Certainly it's recognized that building heights have impacts or potential impacts on views. The CR-3A zone it is an increase in height. However, the CR3 zone as it is does allow for a 4-story building on the property. So it isn't something that is new as 4 stories. Certainly the height increase is different than what the CR3A zone has. But 4 stories is actually permitted currently for the CR3 zone in a separate building if it was further to the rear of the lot. And typically that would mean that it's sunken down so that the rear elevation, for example, on Victoria Avenue would be potentially only 2 stories above grade with a few stories below grade. This particular proposal for a new CR3A zone did come as a result of a delegation to council from one of the property owners who had concerns about not being able to develop their property with the current parking requirements. So that is a major aspect to this, is that we would have reduced parking requirements for these very narrow lots where they're not able to have multiple spaces per residential unit. It would have a reduction, as Greg mentioned earlier, to 1 space per unit, and allow for them to provide the cash in lieu of parking for the commercial spaces and any residential visitor spaces. So that was the origin of it. It wasn't something that the property owner has applied for a particular building. However, with the official community plan allowing for up to 4 stories in this area, and as noted, there's a number of buildings, the top of the rock building, which was displayed, as well as some Yamu Shores, which are further up the hump or the hill between East and West Beach, that are 4 and 5 stories if you include the parking already. That's an acknowledgement of some of the buildings that are already in place. It doesn't mean that every property would be up to 4 stories when it comes to making final application on the development permit to council. But the zone is intended to allow up to what the official community plan is currently allowed. And as Greg noted, we have received many comments about the impacts or potential impacts to views, and can be taking in this feedback and responding by modifying the zone potentially before it goes to council for any bylaw reading. So at this point, this is the earliest stage in the process. We have identified to council some potential parameters of the zone, but they haven't given it any decisions or readings, which would all be part of the next steps I think Greg will be getting into in terms of how the amendment process would proceed. I think I've got quite a few new comments in now here, so I'm just going to take a break and see if Greg wants to take a couple.
Sure. I'm going to take one here. It's from Anonymous. It reads, what does parking have to do with building height? And one thing I didn't provide in the introduction was, and I think Carl has just spoken to a couple things. The intention of this zone is to enable a more efficient and greater use of otherwise constrained properties. So it only applies to properties that meet that maximum lot width of 11.4 meters. And then recognizing that those properties are constrained, there are efforts to enable more floor area through the increase in the FAR number. Also allowing for greater building height at the property line or on the south side. So as measured from, like I mentioned earlier, the midpoint of the lot line fronting onto Marine Drive. So we're taking it from 11.3 to 13.7. And then the question about parking. So there are a number of constraints to these large properties when you try to balance all the different components. Parking does become a challenge to accommodate. There are opportunities to support the non-residential parking supply need within the area of the subject properties, while also providing for what we think is a reasonable parking ratio for what will ultimately be smaller units within a more constrained site.
And I see there are a couple questions about the number of properties in the area that might be able to receive the new zoning if they were to apply. So I wanted to clarify this as well, because I think some of the commentary that has been out in the public about the zone may not be exactly clear. With this proposal at the moment, it's just those two properties that would be having their zone designation changed to CR-3A. There are no other properties at this point in time that would have that designation applied to them. They would have to apply separately to become part of the CR-3A zone. When we did a mail out to property owners to see who was interested in something like this, I believe there were 11 properties that were eligible because their lot frontage was below 12.4 meters and they were unable to be assembled with adjacent properties. There was one other question that was somewhat related to that. I'm just going to publish that now. And the question was, are you not setting this as a precedent? What would stop someone from buying a larger property or buying a larger width property and dividing it to meet the width requirements? So someone would still have to go through a rezoning process to council if someone had a property that was of larger width and had a building on it. Before you could subdivide, you'd have to demolish the building, you'd have to go through council approval. So it would be probably a very risky business without any guarantee that you would get approval in order to do that, and it would be fairly transparent what you're trying to achieve, rather than simply making an application to redevelop a larger property that does have the capacity for the parking to be located on site. So I think the concern around precedent of someone getting a larger property and subdividing is likely not going to be a scenario that occurs, but thank you for that comment.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just reading the comments that are coming in. There are a lot of comments about what could be built on each of the two subject properties from a height perspective. And I think the nice thing about the way that the CR-3A zone has been established is that in the current CR3 zone, there's this discrepancy created by the way that the standard that applies to building height has been established. It's setting two measurements, and it's saying that you take the lesser of the two. Whereas in this current proposed CR3A zoning, it would be, and I'm just going to go back to the cilantro illustration where this shows the maximum build out of the CR3A zone. So this represents a 13.7 meter tall building at a 2.5 meter setback from the property line, and as measured from the midpoint of the property line on Marine Drive. So this zoning is really taking away some of the lacking clarity in what one could build. The other thing that I think causes some confusion in the building height, and again, some of the messaging that we've seen out in the public, is there's this discussion about riding the natural grade up a steep slope. And there's an illustration in the zoning bylaw, and I'll throw it on the screen here. So this illustration represents a two building scenario where you have a portion of a 4-story building sunken into a property where you're measuring height off of the natural grade. And so this particular scenario would not be available within the CR3A zone. Within the CR3A zone, you could build a 4-story building, but it would be measured from, as I say, the midpoint of the property at Marine Drive. So it does take away some of the lacking certainty about how these sites could be built out.
I'll take two questions here. There was one question about the exemption for parking only being applicable for residential commercial owners from Harry. So this proposal would allow for commercial property owners to have cash in lieu provided so that the city could provide parking elsewhere or improve the transportation infrastructure for walking or cycling as an alternative to providing parking on site. And One of the reasons is historically many of the buildings on Marine Drive have developed in that way, and in the town center as well. We did formerly have an option to provide parking as cash in lieu in both of those commercial areas. If you're a homeowner, typically you want to be able to park on your property or very nearby, whereas if you're a customer of the business, you're more likely to be willing to walk a block or two to go to the business that you're looking at. That's a general principle around why this cash in lieu would be allowed for commercial properties but not residential. And the other response to that same question is that if a homeowner is interested in a parking reduction for their own residential property, they can apply for that through a development variance permit as well. There's nothing that would stop someone from making that application, and it would be something that would be an application considered by council. There was one other question before I turn things back to Greg here. So there's a question, does the CR-3A zone only apply to Marine Drive, or does it apply to the whole hillside? At this point, and I can't find the question to publish it yet, but I will do that one as well. There was a question about where does this apply? Could these not be considered separately so that you could consider approving a CR-3A zone, for example, on the Cilantro property, but not the Little India, or vice versa? And the response to that is yes, they are all three separate bylaws that would be brought before council. So one bylaw could establish the CR-3A zone without identifying any of the properties that it would apply to, and the other two bylaws are for one each for each of those properties. So they can be considered separately by council, and no, the CR-3A would not apply to any other properties other than those two or others that make an application to council later on. And there is no requirement that if council approves one of them that it must approve the other, or future applications could be denied on their own merits depending on the circumstances of the property.
Okay, I'll take a couple here. I'm going to publish the next question. It says, when you say midpoint of Marine Drive, what do you mean from the ground, question mark? And this is as it relates to measuring building height. The way that the bylaw was drafted and presented to council was it says specifically that the highest point, the height would be measured from the highest point of the building to the natural grade at the midpoint of the lot line on Marine Drive, on the Marine Drive side of the property. And in speaking with a number of members of the public, I understand that the continued reference to natural grade is proving problematic, and there are links in the presentation that was sent out to the public, and that's available on the city's webpage to some of the reports that have preceded this public information meeting. And so the intention is that the measurement be from essentially the finished grade or finished elevation of that midpoint on Marine Drive. So we recognize these are developed properties, so we want to look at accommodating potentially up to 13.7 meters from the existing elevation of that midpoint. And that's something that can be clarified as we move this work forward.
I've published a couple questions about, could 4-story buildings be built within the existing 37.1 feet? Gary and Doug's question. So yes, it's possible to have 8-foot height ceilings, fairly probably typical of the area when people were expecting 8-foot ceilings in their units. Often 9-foot ceilings is more commonly expected now. One of the reasons we wanted to have a taller ground floor is to have a more inviting commercial presence. Some of the existing commercial buildings built at 8 feet or even less, it doesn't have as inviting of a atmosphere to be walking into that less than spacious environment. So I think there is a minimum ground floor height that's currently proposed in the zone, which would then bump the rest of the building up above the heights. And the minimum height of 13.7 meters would allow for 9-foot ceilings in the remaining levels. However, that is something that can be reviewed if there's an option to reduce the overall height. So instead of 9-foot ceilings in the residential buildings, you have, say, 8-foot ceilings, and the commercial, instead of being a 12-foot, is maybe a 9 or a 10-foot ceiling. That would reduce the overall height of the building, still being slightly higher than the current 11.3 meters or 37.1 feet. But it is a possibility there.
So I'll jump in. I'll publish the next comment question. It says, why cash in lieu? How did you choose the amounts, the $40,000 as it relates to cash in lieu of parking? Seems like a cash grab, and I may defer to Carl on how we arrived at the $40,000 number. But as we discussed, so the cash in lieu piece would only be applicable to the commercial and the visitor portions of the required parking. There would still be the required parking for the residential use. The money itself, if that option were pursued, would go into a fund that would be used to accommodate and to pay for either the construction of parking infrastructure, parking facilities, or investment in things that will help discourage private automobile use. So bicycle lanes, bicycle parking facilities, improved bus stops, and that sort of thing. So that's the intention behind money. Did you want to speak to how we arrived at the amount?
Yeah, and it's described in the staff reports as well that are related to this zone. There were some prior applications where they were also looking to have a parking reduction, and as a way of compensating for that reduction, to provide the city with cash in lieu. And so in those instances, we did do a survey and looked at construction costs for structured parking, and the city having recently built a structured parking facility, we were aware of what the costs were. So the 40,000 is somewhat of an average. It can be higher than that, actually, depending on the site conditions and the number of spaces, the efficiency of the space. But 40,000 is roughly the cost of constructing an underground or structured parking space there.
Sorry, we're getting lots of really good questions here, so we're just reviewing them all before we publish and respond. I
have just published one on the maximum building height, including mechanical structures such as vents or elevator shafts. So maximum building height is to the top of the principal building, but there are exemptions for elevator shafts or stair housing. So even if it's not an elevator shaft, often you'll have a small portion of the building, like on the boathouse, that extends beyond the roof. It's a small portion of the building. It's not the entire part, but that is permitted in the zoning bylaw to extend beyond. That's something that could be looked at as, because it's a general regulation that applies across the entire zoning bylaw, we can select that this zone would maybe not have that provision or would have a different provision that would apply to it. If that is a concern, we can certainly build that into the zone.
Generally, I'm going to just acknowledge there are a number of comments and questions coming in about impacts of this additional height on the residents and landowners in behind, and so I want to acknowledge that we are seeing those comments come in. As I mentioned, the intention of the additional height is to enable more buildability on these constrained lots, but that's not to say that we're disregarding the fact that there may be impacts to people who live behind on their view.
And a comment and question from Malak about why we're referring to 4 stories, being that it's something that's in the official community plan but not any current zoning. So the official community plan review is ongoing, and one of the topics with that is building heights outside of the town center, as well as the town center, but so that is in progress. One of the reasons that we were referring to 4 stories in the waterfront village area is that there are existing buildings on East Beach as well as on the hump that are 4 stories in height within that designation. The Sausalito building, while not on Marine Drive, is also within the, was previously within the CR3 zone, and as has a long history around its completion, including some court litigation matters, but that was a building that's over 3 stories in the area. Ultimately, though, it's not something that each property will be entitled to. When you have a building height maximum within your zone, you still would need to apply to council for a development permit, and part of that would be looking at what the view impacts are, and they would be looking to demonstrate how they're mitigating any potential view impacts to surrounding property owners.
So the next comment is just I think it's a more a question about the relationship between the CR-3A zone and the waterfront village designation. I believe Carl's just sort of touched on that. As Carl mentioned, the Marine Village designation in the official community plan does recognize 4-story buildings, and that may be recognizing the existing composition of those lands and may not be preemptively looking at enabling through the underlying zoning the ability to gain access to more 4-story type buildings. But the relationship is ultimately that the zoning is used to implement the vision of the official community plan. And just on a similar vein, there are a number of comments about why is the city undertaking this review now? Well, there's a concurrent review of the OCP happening. And I think, again, the background on this is that there was some direction provided to the city to undertake a review of this to see if there are opportunities to enable greater use of these constrained sites, while at the same time continuing to advance the conversation around appropriate building heights in the city overall. So I don't necessarily see a conflict. In fact, I see an opportunity that we can look at dovetailing the two as we get closer or move further along in the OCP review.
I had a comment about the links in the presentation not working, and so we will be publishing the presentation, but as it is a presentation within Microsoft Teams, hyperlinks wouldn't be active. We will be publishing it as, if you did not receive it already, I think it was sent out to people who had registered previously, so it may be that this anonymous did not receive that. And so we will ensure, if you email us, we will respond and share that with you directly if you need. There's also a question about the current height of the boathouse building. So the boathouse building is within the CR3 zone and had the building height of roughly 11.9 meters to the top of the stair housing. So that's not the top of the second level, that's the top of the third portion of the building where you exit onto the rooftop deck. It's the very pinnacle of the building there. Up to the top of the second level is approximately 8 meters from the ground at the front there. And again, the comments and questions are coming in fast and furious, so we are going to start to publish the comments more generally, just to make sure that that they're being recognized, that we are receiving these. My apologies, I think I did lose my audio here earlier, so I'll repeat my previous 2 comments there. There was a question about the presentation links not working. We will send those out. So I think you should be able to hear me now. We did have an issue with our audio there for a second, but I believe it's fixed. So the question about links. I think if you didn't hear me earlier, we will be sharing the links from the presentation with everyone if you did not receive the earlier email. And on the question of the building heights for the boathouse, it is 11.9 meters to the top of the stair housing and about 8 meters front to the top of the rooftop deck. If you're standing on the rooftop deck, that's about 8 meters from Marine Drive.
So we're at 6:10 now. So what I'd like to do is I'll touch on next steps and all the comments and questions that we didn't get to. We'll try to get through in the next round. So I'm going to just very briefly outline next steps, and then we'll go through the presentation one more time for people that may be joining us a bit later. And then again, we'll pick up where we left off here on the comments and questions. I may ask that Carl, while I'm going through this again, if you want to publish, Carl, any of the comments that we didn't get to, just so that the public can see that we're receiving their comments.
Yeah, and particularly those, we have many that are comments without specific questions or questions that might have been addressed. I'll be posting those so you can see what other participants have shared, and we'll be also providing this to council as well.
So as I mentioned, the next steps in this project are to evaluate the feedback that we received today. So we will have the transcript of all the comments and questions that we're getting right now to go through. Plus, I've received about 150 emails over the past week with a lot of really good comments that we need to take some time to digest and understand and look at how they may influence some changes to this CR-3A zone. So we're going to spend a few weeks going through all the feedback that we've received, and then likely after the August break, we'll look to present the Land Use and Planning Committee and Council with a draft bylaw for first and second reading. If that's supported by Council, we would then schedule a public hearing. The public hearing will be the opportunity for you to provide your feedback direct to Council. We'll then take the feedback received from that public hearing and then bring a report back to Council for third reading, and if it's supported at third reading, it would then come back to Council for final reading. So it's likely that this will not be scheduled for a public hearing, I suspect, until the month of September or after. So with that, I thank you. We're going to take a very short break, 3-minute break, and then we'll come back and we'll start the presentation all over again here at 6:15. Okay, so we're back. I'm going to start the presentation again. For those of you that may be joining a bit later, my name is Greg Newman. I'm the Manager of Planning with the City of White Rock. I have with me Carl Isaac, the Director of Planning and Development Services, and Athena Van Hossen on the call as well. We're going to go through a presentation, and then we'll spend a bit of time on questions. So the purpose of tonight's meeting is to discuss the details of the draft West Beach Business Area Commercial Residential Small Lot Zone, or the CR-3A zone. We're also hoping tonight to clarify the scope of the application and the zone standards, and then to receive your feedback and questions. If you're just joining us, this is a live event. The meeting is being recorded and will be posted on the city's webpage. We will provide all the comments and questions to council in a future report. So if you don't see them published in the question and answer bar on the right hand side of your screen, you will see them as an attachment to a future report to council. We aren't publishing every comment and question that we receive tonight. If they are not related to the application, if they're repetitive to things that we've already published and spoken to, or if perhaps they're not appropriate in content. Any additional questions that you have after tonight's presentation can be sent to myself at my email address in the slide there. Following the meeting, we'll evaluate the feedback and potential changes to the zone. We'll present a draft bylaw to council for first and second reading. We'll then schedule a public hearing, and that will be your opportunity to speak directly to council on this application. We may then bring a bylaw back to council for third reading and then final reading as well. The application as proposed relates to only 2 properties along Marine Drive, specifically Little India Restaurant and Cilantro Indian Cuisine. We are introducing a template CR-3A zone that if others wish to have the zone apply to their property, they would first need to satisfy the maximum lot width requirement and then apply for rezoning, which would be a process subject to public review and council approval. These are just some images of the 2 properties that are the subject of this application. So you have Little India here, and we wanted just to point out that there are some properties fairly close to Little India that are 3 and 4 stories in their built form. Specifically, the property adjacent to Little India has a covered parkade with 3 stories of residential use above. This is looking the other direction at Little India along Marine Drive. So again, you can see the 3 stories over a single-story parkade in the background there. This is looking at the second property, Cilantro Indian Cuisine. So this is currently a 2-story building adjacent to the Boathouse restaurant, which is also 2 stories with a rooftop patio. Again, just looking at the property a little closer. This is looking at Cilantro from the back. You can see it's a 2-story building. I just wanted to point out in this slide that there is this rooftop stairwell enclosure that represents essentially a 3rd story over top of the boathouse. So this gives you a bit of an indication of the massing and the scale that may be realized with the CR-3A zone being a 3rd and potentially a 4th story above the existing 2-story, or on the site, not in addition to the existing 2-story. Just the policy context. So the subject 2 properties are within the official community plans waterfront village designation, where buildings up to 4 stories in height and 2.0 floor area ratio are recognized. I'll just go through the zoning provisions within the proposed CR-3A zone. This property in the screen here is the Little India site, so I'll use that as the base, but the standards proposed would apply to both sites. This should say maximum lot width being the standard, so in order to be eligible for the CR-3A zone, the maximum lot width that one could have would be 12.4 meters, so you would have to have a lot width of less than that to be eligible for this zone. The maximum building height, which has very obviously been the point of a great deal of interest. So the CR-3A zone would allow for a maximum building height of 13.7 meters, or roughly 45 feet, as measured along the midpoint of the lot line on Marine Drive, so as illustrated here. The current CR3 zone allows for maximum height of 11.3 meters, which is measured from either the natural grade at the midpoint of the wall on the lowest side of the lot, or 0.5 meters above the average height of the curb. And you sort of need to draw it out on a case-by-case basis because it's a little confusing just in the way that it's written. It really does apply on a site-by-site basis. The key thing to note on Marine Drive is that in your CR-3A zone, the height is measured, would be measured from between 1.5 and 2.5 meters back from Marine Drive. It does stipulate the minimum and a maximum setback for buildings along Marine Drive. Ultimately, the proposal, if approved, would enable an additional roughly 2.5 meters of building height, or roughly 8 feet on each of these two properties. The building setbacks proposed within the CR-3A zone would be a minimum front yard setback of 2.5 meters and an exterior setback of 1.5 meters. And we've spoken with a number of residents that feel that we should be also incorporating interior side yard setbacks and rear yard setbacks. So those are things that we can look at as we move this forward. The CR-3A zone has a 1.5 meter interior side yard and rear yard setback, which may be a standard that we could bring forward into this zone. Parking would be required at a rate of 1 space per unit for any 1 unit, 2 unit, or 3 unit residential use, plus 1 space for visitors. The standard rate of parking outside of this zone is 2 spaces per 1, 2, and 3 unit residential use. The general parking standard or the requirements for commercial uses would apply in this zone. And another important amendment that has been introduced is to look at the potential provision of cash in lieu of parking in the amount of $40,000 per space for the required commercial and visitor parking only, so not for the residential portion of the parking requirement. The maximum density or gross floor area that is proposed in the CR-3A zone is 2.0 times the lot area, provided that an amenity contribution of $645 per square meter is provided for the floor area above 1.75. So as an example, if we take the Little India property, it's roughly 180 square meters in area at 2.0 FAR, floor area ratio, would allow for 360 square meters of gross floor area, roughly 3,800 square feet. To build at 2.5 FAR, 0.25 of the lot area would be subject to an amenity contribution of $645 per square meter, which works out to about $29,000, and that money would go into a fund and used for amenity enhancements along Marine Drive in the Waterfront Village area. We've put together some illustrations of what the build out of the CR-3A zone might look like within the 2 subject properties. So this is the Little India site. You can see the build out would accommodate a building of up to 4 stories in height. This is drawn within the existing context, so you see the building's relationship to the existing building to the east, as well as the building to the west. And then this is the Cilantro illustration as well that shows a 4-story building, so 13.7 meters in height. Relative, again, you can see relative to the context. So we'll now open it up to round 2 of the questions and comments, and maybe I'll look to Carl to get us started.
Thanks, Greg. I'm responding to some of the questions that have been published in the comment section, and also seeing that we are getting new ones coming in as well. So there's a question about why can't the parking be underground to avoid the height increase. I'll speak to that one. So for example, at the Little India property on 15081 Marine Drive, the property width doesn't allow for a ramp to be constructed to underground parking. So and to have both a ramp and parking spaces, it's so narrow that you couldn't actually accomplish that. As well, you wouldn't want it coming off of the high side of the property along Marine Lane, because that would be then coming out and having additional ramp space without gaining any parking spaces. Alternatively, having it off of Marine Drive, again, isn't something that we want for our pedestrian-oriented commercial area. So what they're left with in terms of parking capacity on the site is typically a perpendicular space off of the lane. So you would have 3 side-by-side roughly 3-meter wide spaces that could be accommodated on these properties, which are typically 9, 10, 11 meters in width. Again, the same would apply to the Cilantro property at 14945 Marine Drive. It is much deeper and has access off of Victoria Avenue instead of the lane. However, that also is in an area where we would have flood construction levels that might be challenging to construct underground parking in that area. So they would be hit by kind of both constraints around underground parking.
I'll speak to a couple here. So I'll publish a question from Doug King. Doug asks, will the CR-3A zoning apply to the lots north of Marine Lane as well, because they are also in the Waterfront Village area designation? So as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, the CR-3A zone that is the subject of this application would only, if approved, apply to the two properties, the Cilantro Indian Cuisine and the Little India. Any other landowner in the city could apply to rezone their property to fall within the CR-3A zone. I will say that in the preamble to the zone itself, it does acknowledge that the intention of the zone is to accommodate commercial and multi-unit residential uses in the West Beach business area on lots having frontage of less than 12.4 meters in width, and to encourage the redevelopment of properties on Marine Drive with access and size constraints in a form that fits within the surrounding streetscape. So while someone could apply for the CR-3A zone and not be on Marine Drive, I think it would be difficult potentially to support from a staff perspective, given the explicit intention of the zone as stated in the actual zone.
I'll take two questions that have been published in the comment section. So there's a question about the geodetic heights of apartments to the east, by which I understand you would be meaning the top of the rock or semi-ambu shores buildings potentially. Those are some of the more recent construction, although there are smaller buildings, apartment buildings constructed from the 50s to the late 70s as well. So those are RM4 Marine Drive medium density zoned properties, and the maximum height in that area is 7.7 meters or 25 feet. However, in that case, they are determined by the natural grade of where the building is sited on the lot, and so with the slope on the properties, if you go from their parkade level, if they have parking off of Marine Drive, as do the top of the rock and semi-ambu shores, and measure from that point to the top of the building, it would be significantly above 25 feet, because the average natural grade might come out somewhere in the middle of the building. But the way they are measured according to the zoning bylaw for those properties, it's measured on the average natural grade of the property, unlike the CR3 and 3A zones, which are measured from the base Marine Drive fronting lot line. The other question was around cash in lieu for community amenity contributions cannot be demanded from any developer, and so in this case there would be a base density in the zone, which would be what's currently allowed in the zone, and that is available in the staff reports with the draft bylaw. The current density that's allowed is 1.75 times the lot area, and the bonus density would require a contribution or the amenities in order to enable that density bonus. So the property owner would not be required to do it if they're going to build up to what the base density is, so it's not something that's being demanded. It's a density bonus piece which is allowed in the Local Government Act that controls how local governments deal with land use and development. And the cash in lieu of parking portion, the property owner could develop a building that does comply with the parking. It would be difficult to provide anything of a significant size because of the constraints. So the cash in lieu enables them to build more and for the city to provide parking elsewhere. I'll turn things back to Greg now.
So I'm going to publish some comments that we won't offer a response to, but again, I think in part because they may pertain to more political matters or matters outside of the scope of the application, but I will publish them so that there's an acknowledgement of their receipt, specifically relative to whether or not there be compensation to existing owners as it relates to potential infringement on their review, or sorry, on their view. There are some specific questions about can we provide other illustrations of renderings that show a building built to the 44.9 feet versus a 37. We don't have one. We could do one, but I'm not sure that that's necessary to make the points that we're making and to generate the discussion that we're generating. But again, I appreciate the feedback and the comment. There's a question about whether or not the height, the setback would apply to all stories of the building or just the first story. And so the setback applies to all stories of the building. There may be permitted projections into that front yard setback for things like balconies.
Enclosed patio.
Enclosed patios, right? So marine drive, so enclosed patios. So there would be, the bylaw does contemplate projections into setbacks of a certain limited nature. There's a comment again. I don't know that we'll speak to it, but it does ask, or does at least make the point that won't increased height and density result in additional constraints to parking where perhaps those constraints are already felt. The opportunity that exists with taking cash in lieu is that it does allow the city to look at ways that we can, as I mentioned in the first presentation, discourage private auto use. So if we make facilities better for cyclists, we may be able to actually encourage people to get out of their cars, but you kind of need a full-on investment to make that happen.
I've got a question, it's a two-part question. The first being, why is the new zoning being proposed before a promised review of the OCP? So as I mentioned in the earlier presentation, may not have been here, we are in the middle of an OCP review, which includes review of building heights outside of the town center. However, the zoning was brought to council in response to a delegation that had requested a specific zoning for their properties, which is constrained for a variety of physical reasons and not being able to provide parking, etc. And council did request that staff draft a zoning bylaw for this. It is also part of council's strategic priorities to look at the zoning for the waterfront zones, which are CR3 and CR4 zones, CR4 being East Beach. So in response to that request, the zoning is being brought forward. The other part to that question says, what is the vertical height difference between the midpoint of the front of the lot line and the curb? That doesn't specify a specific property, so I can't give an exact answer, and I wouldn't have that information in front of me, but it is something that you'd likely be able to experience as you're walking down the sidewalk. If you're walking down the sidewalk and your uphill leg is much higher than the lower leg, that would be essentially you're experiencing a sloped difference there. For the most part, we have very few areas where there would be a difference of any significance, because we do want to have flat surface areas for pedestrians to walk safely. So it would probably be a matter of inches, if any difference at all, less than a foot, depending on how far back the curb is. Sometimes we have a wider sidewalk versus otherwise, but it is relatively minimal.
There's a question about where can members of the public find information on the natural grade of properties, and this is a challenge, and this is why in the first presentation there was some discussion about the fact that the current zoning to an extent relies on measurements from a natural grade, and the natural grade is a historic elevation of the land, and surveyors are even saying to us that they have some concern with their ability to measure that, in particular on sites that have been very heavily redeveloped or developed. So we don't have sort of a topographic map of all natural grades. And that's why I think it's important that as we continue this conversation, we look at whether or not we're using the right base point to take our measurements from. So as I mentioned, the proposed building height measurement would be taken from the natural grade of the midpoint of the lot line fronting onto Marine Drive, and that may not be the right place to take the measurement from. We may want to look at taking the measurement from the existing elevation of that midpoint, so that there's not this discrepancy on how tall a building could be at that point. There was another comment, and I'll publish it. There's a comment about the renderings, and I think the comments are fair. I feel that renderings are quite challenging, no matter how you put them together. We have a tree in one of the renderings. It is actually there on site, on the ground, but the purpose of the renderings was really just to help generate discussion, and I think they have helped to do so. They're not a very flattering view of these two properties. They really do show what the build out of these two sites could be at the within the CR-3A zone provisions.
There's a question about the building heights, current zoning for the new condos on the corner of Marine and Oxford. Those buildings, we'll refer to it as the Newport complex or building. That zone is the CD29 zone. It's a comprehensive development zone, so it's specific to that property and no others in the city. There are heights specific to each block of buildings, so there's 4 different blocks and they're measured in geodetic heights. Ranging from 13.35 meters above geodetic, which is close to the sea level essentially, and that goes up to 15.21 meters. Now with the flood construction level that we have in the city in that area being 3.8 meters, that means that the building itself is approximately 11.41 meters. I don't have the drawings in front of me, so there may be a slight variation from that, and then that wouldn't include any additional encroachments above that, such as elevator overruns that are in that building. And that the tallest building is the one right at the corner of Oxford and Buena Vista, which is a 4-story apartment building in that area.
A couple other questions. So I don't have an answer for you on this question, but I do think it's a good question. So it asks how much increase in height would be gained by the starting point being mid-frontage versus lower property point. So as Carl was mentioning, as you walk up the slope from corner to corner of the property along the frontage on Marine Drive, there can be an increase in elevation. It can be a couple feet. It can be more than a couple of feet or less. But yeah, I think it's a good point. It's something that we can evaluate as we go back and look at, again, how we take that height measurement on Marine Drive. Is it from the low point of the frontage on Marine Drive? There was, that one, Carl?
Yeah, I do. There's 2 questions very similar, and one was responded to in writing already, but just because it came up again. So the Cilantro property, there's a question about the amenity contribution amount for that property, and because it's a 5,400 square foot property, it's slightly larger than 15081 Marine Drive. The amount of CACs or amenity contributions for that density bonus would be a roughly $81,000 contribution for that density bonus.
There's another question here about whether or not the 2 properties are being treated differently or should be treated differently because of the composition of the lands in behind them. So should a 4-story property at Little India be looked at differently than a 4-story building at Cilantro, because the impact of a taller building on one property may be different than the impact on another? And I think it's an interesting comment, and I've published that. I think it's something that we can look at. As we mentioned at the beginning of this application is specific to 2 properties. In the future, if other landowners wanted to seek approval of the same application, the CR-3A zone, to their properties, they'd be looked at on the merits of the application itself, the contextual factors that apply. So I think it's something that we can evaluate moving forward.
I published a question from Aaron. Is CR3 zoning applicable to properties under 5,700 square feet? So I think Aaron might be referring to minimum lot areas. So when a property owner wants to subdivide their property, we do have minimum lot areas to create new lots within that zone. For example, if you had a large acreage and it's 80,000 square feet, and your minimum lot area to create new lots is 8,000 square feet. You'd have the number of lots based on the amount of square footage there. There are lots, however, with minimum lot areas that are larger than the existing lot itself, so that you'd have a lot in the CR3 zone that was created potentially in 1915 or 1930. It's historic, but it still has the CR3 zoning applicable to it. You wouldn't be able to subdivide that further, but any of the zoning provisions that regulate how buildings are constructed and sited on that property would apply to it. Just the fact that it's less than the minimum lot area that's applied for new lots in that zone wouldn't prevent it from having the other application of the zoning bylaw to it. I'm going to turn my camera off and look for more questions to respond to here. So bear with us if there's a moment of silence.
There is a question here about how high above the stair housing on the boathouse restaurant would represent 4 stories. I'm going to jump to a bit of a massing illustration that we put together. This massing illustration is the view from in front of Victoria Terrace. It shows the potential massing of a building roughly built to the CR-3A zone standards at the Cilantro restaurant. And the stair well at the boathouse restaurant represents essentially the 3rd story. So you could get another 6 to 8 feet above the top portion of that stairwell within the CR-3A zone, and that's roughly what that box, that transparent box, represents.
So I have now published all of the comments that were in the inbox. Some have been moved to the side if they're repeating or off topic. But just responding to the ones that were latest published, there's a question about why is the council entertaining additional height allowances. So it won't be speaking to council's decisions around this. It was in response to a delegation that this draft zoning bylaw was brought forward, but as I mentioned in a written response to earlier comment, a specific height increase was not requested by council. It is something that was drafted because it was looking to implement what is allowed within the official community plan. Ultimately, council can decide to not approve this zone entirely or to modify it, or staff can modify it before it goes to council. That is something that council has the opportunity to decide on. Typically, there's a question about entertaining allowances or applications, and I'll maybe use this moment because we've had similar questions around applications to the city. Why is the city even entertaining a particular application? And we actually do not have the ability to tell an applicant you may not apply for a particular use of property. Each application must be received and processed. It can always be said no depending on the nature of the application, but in terms of proposals that come in from property owners, we have a process that has to be respected. We have to follow the Local Government Act around receiving applications and processing them, and we do have a public process. So this public information meeting that we're having now is part of what a private property applicant would have to do as well. When they're bringing their application forward to council, we're sharing what's in the draft zone, we're getting your feedback and can modify things before it goes to council. And this is importantly not your only opportunity to speak to this. At the moment you're in discussion virtually with staff. Any zoning amendment bylaw, however, does require a public hearing when it goes for consideration to council, and that's an opportunity where you can write in your comments or speak directly to council. Currently under the COVID public health orders, we have had one public hearing which was for a project, and we're limited to not having hearings in council chambers, but we are offering the opportunity to provide written comments as well, as I said, and to attend the community center where you have a video feed and can provide your comments to council that way. So there are future opportunities to provide and share your comments with our council. There was a question about the main comparable being the hump residential properties or the apartment properties, I think to the east of the commercial area is what's being referred to. There aren't comparable 4-story buildings in the West Beach commercial area, if that's what's being referred to. I think the Newport building at the far west of the commercial area, it's actually on the Buena Vista frontage, so not on Marine Drive, is a 4-story building, whereas other buildings in the area are 3 stories. In terms of comparables, I know that with previous applications, such as the Boathouse or other properties that are now part of the fabric in the community, a similar process requiring comments from the public and review by council and consideration of view impacts was something that occurred when it was initially proposed and built. So that is a comparable in the process, but we don't have a comparable 4-story building in the commercial areas on West Beach.
I'll publish a recent comment here about the elevator shaft not being shown in the rendering I just pointed to. I do want to speak to a comment that came up in the earlier session. So the question that came up in the earlier session was, could there be projections like elevator shaft stairwells above the 4th story or above the 13.7 meters that would be enabled within the CR-3A zone? And the answer right now is yes. There are general provisions in the bylaw that apply to all lands. So there could be elevator shafts, but that may be something that we can evaluate as we move forward. If we were, we could build in reference to those exemptions not being applicable within the CR-3A zone.
And the other comment, which was just published, the bylaws were not put forth because of a development application. No, it was a delegation to council, someone speaking to council about their property. There were several options presented in terms of how the applicant or the property owner could move ahead, including making their own individual development application. However, we were directed to prepare a zoning amendment bylaw related to this. The obligation, what obligation to the owners does the city have to approve these spot zonings? There is no obligation for council or the city, but it ultimately is council who decides on zoning amendment applications, even those that are initiated by the city. To approve these, council has full discretion to vote as they see fit, and there isn't an obligation to the owners on that.
So the next question was about how will we be contacting members of the public about this application moving forward, and I appreciate the question. There's been a lot of really good buzz, if you will, about this proposal. A lot of word of mouth has led to members of the public becoming aware of it. We did give notice to all landowners within 100 meters of both of the 2 properties, in addition to several of the properties just outside of that catchment area, knowing that some of those properties just on the fringe accommodate tens of people because they're stratified buildings. We'll be providing notification of any future public hearing in the Peace Arch News, in the city's events calendar, and we'll also be doing notice out to landowners as well. I'm happy if people wish to send me an email with their contact information and a request that they be notified of any future activity related to this application to give them specific notice when we do start to move this file forward towards a report to the Land Use and Planning Committee and then a public hearing.
Next question, what sort of density classification would these 2 properties be if they receive the CR-3A zoning? So with a 4-story building, if you have a commercial restaurant or retail at grade, you'd likely have at most 4 or 5 units in the 3 levels above that, maybe 6. In a 4-story building format, typically we would look at that kind of by convention as a low-rise building. It might be considered medium density. There isn't a particular density classification in the current CR3 zone, but you could look at that as kind of a low to medium density in relation to other zones that the city has. The 2.0 lot area, density of floor area, that would put it below the high density residential zoning in the city, which is 2.0 residential floor area. It ends up being something more like 2.3 or 2.4 gross floor area. So it's below what our high density zone is, the RM3 zone for residential. It is a relatively small building, but it's on a small lot as well. So I would classify it as a low-rise, medium-density building, but that doesn't have any official standing per se. It doesn't have a connotation in terms of fees provided to the city.
I've just provided in the Q&A there my email. So if you wish to be added to a list of people that would like to be notified of future steps in this application, please send me an email and I'll add you to a list. I may not be able to respond to every email as they come in, but I can assure you I'm keeping the list, and we'll send out sort of more generic, far-reaching emails to everyone on that list.
There's a question, the whole hillside should have been informed. I guess it's more of a comment. So as I think we've noted earlier, we did publish in the Peace Arch News and put on our city website the event that's happening tonight. And thank you for the comments subsequent to that. Found this is an excellent way to engage digitally. I know that there will be a range of opinions on that. And as this is our first use of a virtual public information meeting, I'm happy to understand what the feedback was, whether there's technical glitches or other aspects that you think could be improved, because we are limited in how we can engage with you, but we definitely want to hear from the community. In regards to the mail out or informing the whole hillside, there is a cost to that as well in terms of postage and paper that would be used if we were going to be sending it out to all properties in White Rock or even hillside. I would note that the Victoria Terraces properties are actually slightly outside of the 100-meter buffer around these properties, and while normally we would not include all properties that are outside of that, I am aware that this particular topic would be of interest to property owners there, and evidently it has been through a lot of the correspondence that we've received. So we did go beyond what our normal typical requirements would be for the mail out. But certainly if there are ways to allow for future expansion of how we communicate with the public, we're looking into that. If a public hearing is occurring, we would also be mailing out to the same properties, and we'd be publishing in the Peace Arch News notice of that hearing, as well as putting it on our website.
I'll respond to a couple of questions here. So will all questions be posted eventually? Yes, so there is a transcript that will come out of this, or at least a summary of all the comments and questions that are being received, and that will form part of a future report to council. So all questions that were received tonight will be presented as part of the future report. There's a comment about the number of parking spots potentially per unit. So the proposed zoning would require 1 space per 1 unit, 2 unit, and 3 unit residence. The comment speaks to what I'm reading as potentially a 6 unit residence. So a 6 unit residence would not be permitted within the CR-3A zone. It would that would be a multifamily use that wouldn't be permitted. So the single vehicle per unit would not apply itself to a 6 unit building.
I just had a response to a question about how many other properties in West Beach have frontage less than 12.4 meters. So I did include in my written response the addresses for the 11 properties which were sent a letter about this, which all have frontage less than 12 meters. I should note that there were a few properties that qualified based solely on the maximum lot width, but because they were owned by someone who also owned adjacent parcels and could be assembled with those as part of a redevelopment, they were not included in this because they have other opportunities for their parking provision on site. So that does provide you with a list of the properties that potentially would have this zoning applied to them if they make an application to council and it's approved.
There's a comment I'll publish regarding why does White Rock need more density? Has the 9th highest density. Yeah, I don't think that's the intention behind this rezoning. I think in part it's to allow for a more efficient use of constrained lands along Marine Drive. So we'll sort of leave it at that.
I had a question. Are there any other 4-story applications in this Marine Drive area from Oxford East? So we do not have any applications that are right on Marine Drive. And to be clear, this isn't an application by a property owner, although it does relate to 2 property owners who have opted into something that the city initiated. So it's a bit of a nuance there. I hope you appreciate that. But in terms of applications from property owners for redevelopment of their property, we do not have those on Marine Drive. There is an application at 1164 Elm Street, which is 1 block back from Marine Drive for a 4-story building there. It's also at the initial stages of its application. It has not had a public information meeting, but if it did have a public information meeting, we'd be looking to amend our procedures bylaw so that they could host it in a similar format to this. It's likely that we're not able to have a full kind of in-person open house type public information meeting. So that's the only other application in the area, but again, it's not on Marine Drive, it's 1164 Elm Street.
So just being cognizant of time, I think we'll be able to take a couple more questions, and then we'll have to wrap up tonight's digital public information meeting.
And I just published a comment from Brian, and somewhat of a question. So stating the lane is 10 meters above the street, so average grade is 5 meters above the curb. Add this to the maximum height and 5 levels is the result with more than 18 meters or about 60 feet. Is this correct? So no, that's not how you would measure the average grade for the CR3 or CR3A zone. So that's taking a point that's mid-property north to south. And what we're actually looking at as the base of the building for the measurement is along the front lot line along Marine Drive, the midpoint of that, but from east to west. So that would be essentially, I don't have the, if the lane is 10 meters above the street, you would have a building that sticks out roughly 3.7 meters above the lane because it's approximately 10 meters below the lane to the street. I hope that makes sense. I know that without a diagram that can be a challenging mental picture to create. Maybe we could throw up one that shows something along those lines, but we can also bring forward more information there. So this is a section drawing, and so you have to imagine that you're looking at the building from the west with Marine Drive on the right hand side of the screen. The property line is the black line that's going up there vertically. So that would be where you start the measurement of the building. It doesn't increase as you go to the left. That would be going up through the midpoint of the lot north to south. We'll try to have more illustrations that show this if that still causes some confusion.
So as I mentioned, I think we have maybe time for one more. There's a question about whether or not we'll commit to doing a mail out to the entirety of the hillside. I think that's something that we'll have to take back and evaluate with our communications team. So with that, I think we have Carl will do one more, and then I think we'll have to wrap it up.
There's a question: in what way are the 2 subject properties constrained? What is the rationale for the new zoning? So I would refer you to the whole staff report because I can't summarize it all in 2 minutes. There'll be links provided to that. But essentially you've got properties that front onto Marine Drive and are 9 meters or 10 meters in width. So they're not able to provide the parking that would be required on their properties under the current zoning. The current zoning says for every residential unit of 1, 2, or 3 units, you have to provide 2 parking spaces. So a 3-unit building, maybe it's 2 units on the 2nd floor and 1 unit above. You'd have to have 6 parking spaces, but you physically cannot fit those on the property. That's one of the constraints that's related to it. The other is that because in the case of the Little India property, 15081 Marine Drive, the slope of the property means that you can't have ramp access for one, and we don't want to be allowing for driveway access off of Marine Drive because we want that to be a more walkable area where you don't have vehicles crossing the sidewalk. But again, if you can read the whole staff report, which will provide links to that, gives you some more of the background around the constraints for that.
So we'll take one last comment, and it's not related, well, I think it is related to this, but it asks, when is the anticipated OCP, when will the OCP review be completed? And I won't give a specific date, but I do appreciate the question because there are some interconnectedness between this and the OCP review as it relates to discussions around building height. And with COVID being what it is and somewhat greatly hindering our ability to have public conversations about some of the topics that are under review within the OCP, we haven't been able to really look at continuing the discussion of some of the policy options that are available within the OCP. There was a survey done, open houses and other discussions that have allowed us to gather some preliminary feedback. We're now digesting that feedback and looking at options. So we would like to start to look at maybe digital means and other forums to allow the public to engage on some of the emerging ideas and options that are coming out of that. So yeah, I appreciate the question, the opportunity with this group to be able to kind of give an announcement on that topic. So Carl can publish the comments and questions that we're getting, but we won't have a chance to get to them tonight. In terms of next steps, as I mentioned, we'll be evaluating this feedback and looking at potential changes to the CR-3A zone. We'll then draft a bylaw and take it to the Land Use and Planning Committee and Council for first and second reading. If it's supported by Council, we'll look to schedule a public hearing. We'll then have the public hearing, and that will provide you an opportunity to speak directly to Council. We'll then bring the bylaw back to Council for third reading, and if it receives approval of third reading, then we would bring it back for final reading. So with that, I do want to thank you for your time tonight. Were there any other comments you wanted to add, Carl? Okay, well, thanks very much. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we've recorded this video, so a copy will be published on the city's webpage. And I'm happy to be your point of contact if you have questions moving forward. So thanks very much.